Thank you all for attending this ESG training. For those who joined us in the first hour, as I stated just a few minutes ago, a lot of the general information is the same. So that's the great part about sort of the match requirements is that it's general information. So I will definitely go through some of the similar slides, but really talk about those requirements for ESG. Um, we've been working with hosts there for over a year at this point, I believe. You know, in the community doing the housing search help, and we created some match guides, some match forms for you all, and also um, we're doing these match trainings for you all there. So feel free to ask any questions that you have. I can see the chat. Midori's seeing it as well. Raise your hand if you want to do it that way, or if you want to go wait until the end, we can answer any questions you have then as well. I'm also joined by my colleague Nick Mitchell. I believe he's off screen for now, but he may jump in. But let's jump right into it. Nick, are you there?
I'm there.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So just want to really set the stage for us for this next hour or under an hour. Uh, we'll talk about sort of understanding match, go into the definition of it. What are those requirements, the key requirements for ESG match? What are those eligible uses for match funds? This is where things deviate a little bit from the COC program. Obviously, there are different, somewhat similar but different eligible activities related, for the COC program versus the ESG program. And then we'll also talk about the eligible sources and the topic that everyone loves, sort of those documentation requirements. Next slide, Nick. So again, understanding match, and we'll really talk about sort of what is match, what is not match. And the next slide, we'll talk about and give you all sort of a definition. And again, if you've seen this slide before, the one thing that you will see different is the match amount. So Nick, can you go to the next slide, please? So, match is the term that we really coined to represent the non federal share of costs that the recipient is required to contribute to accomplish the grant purposes. Um, Unlike COC, which is a 25% match, ESG requires a 100% match. Next slide. Okay. Now, what is match? You can have match funds that are either cash or you can also use in-kind contributions. You must use match to cover the eligible costs of the project. You also want to ensure that any cost that you incur by any costs that are incurred by a partner organization to provide in-kind services, they must be documented in an MOU, and it must be for the program participants. And you have to do this documentation via the MOU prior to the grant agreement execution with host. You also want to ensure that you can use program income, i.e., program participant rent that comes directly to the project as match. So this is one thing that this is allowable with ESG dollars. Next slide, please. What is not match? So you can't really use cash or any in-kind contributions for that you already used for another grant. So say for instance, you have a huge grant that has more money than you need, and you want to use that also for ESG, that's not allowed. You can't use cash or in-kind contributions that are statutorily prohibited. The list of what's statutorily prohibited. Excuse me, I have someone at my door. So you may have heard my Alexa. I apologize. Um, but it's just a delivery, so I'll get it afterwards. But you want to make sure that if it is prohibited by statute, then you can't use that cash or in-kind contribution as the match for the ESG program. You can't use in-kind services provided without an MOU. So again, you may have good intentions to make sure that you use in-kind services and they may be useful to your clients, but you need to ensure that it is documented in a memorandum of understanding. And Midori mentioned this earlier, but if you all have any questions about any acronyms that we're using throughout this presentation, please do ask, but I'll also be cognizant of just saying what we mean by any of these acronyms as well. You also can't use any program participant savings. So this is savings that belong to the program participant, any money that you are holding on their behalf for any rental deposits that you're getting from them, as that they receive from any type of income that they have. You can't, so you want to make sure that if it's savings that belong to the program participant and it doesn't belong to you, then you cannot use that as a match. And then also any federal benefits provided directly to the program participant. So that's food stamps, any other type of benefits, disability benefits will not be able to be used as part of the match program. Okay, any questions about any of that? Awesome sauce. Next slide. So now we're going to go into those key requirements. And just, again, always remember that, this presentation that we're doing today is really sort of a general. There's not much to match, right? It's just about really thinking through, what are those eligible costs, those eligible activities? What do I need to have in writing? And how do I document it throughout this process? And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a few minutes, okay? So next slide, Nick. So you want to ensure that these are some of the key requirements again, and you want to ensure that you secure the match contributions for the project, and that you are providing those commitments. The host usually asks for a commitment letter during the NOFA process. So when you apply for the funds, you need to secure the match funds. Doesn't mean that it needs to be sort of in your account or that you have it already, but there is a MOU saying that we're going to agree to provide you these, or some type of agreement in writing that they're going to provide you with the funds, and that you show that commitment letter, attach that commitment letter to your application for funding. You also want to ensure that you're meeting the 100% requirement. And this is on eligible activities over the grant term. So for ESG, this includes homelessness prevention, rental housing, relocation and stabilization services. You have financial assistance, you have the services piece. So anything related to housing search and placement, case management, mediation, legal services, credit repair, all of those ESG component activity types. Well, I'll talk more about that on one of the next slides as well. You also, yeah, I see that, Cassie, thank you for it. It's 100%, which is sometimes difficult to get, but I know a lot of you are able to secure those funds. You must be able to track and document all costs. We'll show you a really good graph at the end of the presentation that really talks about those document pieces and what you need to show and how you need to track it throughout that grant term. And then follow any procedures. This is from HUD. This is from the state, federal government, from hosts, internal procedures that you all have as programs. Make sure that you're following these procedures and reporting formats to collect and compile the match information. As you all know, working with HUD and federal funding, you just got to document everything and really use best practices when determining how to operate your programs, including the match requirement. Next slide, please. So I already started talking about this a little bit, but we're going to talk about the eligible uses for match. Next slide, Nick. Okay, so you can use match for any eligible costs under subpart B of 24 CFR Part 576. I just had to say that because this is, HUD. And this includes the following components: activities and allowable costs. So you have homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, and emergency shelter. You all are already aware that hosts, the street outreach and HMIS and other administrative costs are not currently funded by host. So we won't give much attention to those, but listed them there just so you know sort of what is enumerated in the subpart B of 24 CFR Part 576. So again, this includes under homelessness prevention, that is any of your rental housing or rental assistance. This includes rental arrears. You have financial assistance, so application fees, security deposits, last month's rents, utility deposits, utility payments, moving costs. Any of the services related that I mentioned a little bit earlier. In terms of rapid rehousing, a lot of the same costs that I already stated. Emergency shelter, so you have essential services, you have operations. You also have, it depends on, but these are eligible activities. Whether or not you can fund them includes renovation, major rehab, and conversion as well. So those are some of the eligible costs by component activity type, and you can use match for any of these costs. Okay, any questions about that before we move on? Okay, awesome. Next slide, Nick. So let's talk about sources, which for ESG, things are just a little bit different, of course. HUD and the Congress couldn't make them completely the same. That just would have been too easy. But we're going to go right to the next slide. As we already said, there are two types of match. That's cash and in-kind. Next slide, Nick. So cash match, we talked about this definition, but again, we probably have some new folks on this training as well. Cash match is when the recipient or subrecipient spends actual funds on eligible program costs, cash money. Cash counts as match only if the recipient or subrecipient can demonstrate that a payment of funds was made to cover the cost of program eligible activities expended during the grant term, okay? Next slide. So it's a lot on this slide. I'll try to summarize it. So in general, you can use any funding that includes federal other than ESG funding, right? So you may have ESG funding that's still a carryover from a previous year, or you have two types of ESG grants, but you can use other federal funding. So you can use CLC funding, you can use CDBG funding. I talked about that earlier, and I'll explain what I mean by that as well. But you can use state, local, or private funds as well to satisfy the match requirement. Okay, so long as the following conditions are met. So so you have to ensure that the funds are contributed to the ESG program and expended for the subrecipient's allowable ESG costs. So those costs that I just I didn't list out, but I talked about them. And if you guys already did receive the ESG match guides, you'll see that on those guide documents, as well as the forms that you'll be filling out as well, that just literally has those eligible costs for you, but based on line items that you all are already used to. If it is a federal source, you have to ensure that the governing law for that federal source does not prohibit its use as ESG match. Again, I am not sure of some of those sort of funding streams that are strictly prohibited from match, but you just want to make sure that it doesn't prohibit you to use the ESG fund to match ESG funds. You also need to ensure that the funds meet a matching requirement of another. If ESG funds are used to meet a matching requirement of another particular federal source, then that source may not be a source of the match for ESG. So that's really convoluted, but I think you have to really follow the funding in that sense. So if you use ESG to match COC, then you can't use that COC funds that's using ESG funds to match the ESG to match the ESG program that you're trying to match now. So it's pretty much, follow the money, follow the funds. You also want to ensure that, the funds are used in accordance with all requirements that apply to the ESG grant funds. That includes eligibility requirements and eligible costs. So a big piece is here, and we're not going to talk about it, is are you using it for the eligible population? You also want to make sure that the funds are expended. That is, the allowable cost is incurred. So the cost is incurred, not necessarily when funds are drawn down, but it's incurred within the sub-recipient agreement period. So, within that year, within those 18 months, within those 2 years, however long the grant period lasts. You also want to ensure that you have not been and will not, the matching funds have not been and will not be used to match any other federal program funds, nor any other ESG grant. So whatever you're using the match for your ESG program or grant, you want to make sure it is specific to whatever grant that you're working with. You can't share any matching funds. Also, and I can't even see this because I hate when this happens. Oh, documentation. Always keep good documentations. You want to make sure that you keep records for the source and use of the matching funds. So always remember and develop policies to track the funding. Okay. Any questions about the eligible sources of cash for the ESG program? Nope. Okay. Next slide. All right. So this here is talks about documentation. So this is for cash documentation. So prior to the grant period, the match should be documented by the subrecipient in the form of a commitment letter. Okay, this commitment letter must include the following information on agency letterhead, signed and dated by an authorized representative. So you want to have the amount of cash to be provided to the recipient for the project, a specific date the cash will be made available, the actual grant and fiscal year to which the cash match will be contributed, the time period during which funding will be available, and allowable activities to be funded by the cash match. So again, take a look at the match guides. This will provide all of the information that I just stated as it pertains to the commitment letter for the period prior to the grant period. During the grant period, you want to ensure that you track the match through your agency's financial statements, general ledgers, and other records to indicate that it has been spent on eligible program expenses during the grant term. So this financial tracking is what you're doing already anyway with the ESG grant. And you just want to make sure that it's consistent and that you are constantly making sure that expenses are being tracked for the allowable costs. So at the halfway point, you want to make sure you submit a match report. And this, Midori, if you could let us know again when this will start happening for the grantees. I don't know if it's been decided yet.
Almost all my ESG subrecipients are going to have amendments because their award amount for 2023 changed, and so it will be in the amendment to do.
Awesome sauce. So to be announced. But you also want to make sure that this report demonstrates the total match amount contributed to the project and what's been expended on eligible costs with full documentation. So everything from the commitment letter to the financial tracking should be a part of this midterm grant report that you all will be submitting in the near future. Okay. And then at the close of the grant period, you want to have the final grant report and the documentation. So this is final. It's closed. You incurred all your costs, you submitted reimbursements, and you just want to show and document, as we've been saying over and over again, to ensure that you have eligible ensure you have been tracking those costs and that you've been using the matching funds for eligible costs. Okay. And Midori just put a note in here, and I'll just read it to everyone. To be super clear, host is requiring a midterm report to make sure things are on track. This is not a hub requirement. Thank you for that, Midori. Best practice just across the board, I think, for the program providers and for hosts. We're all able to identify any issues that may be happening due to changes of staffing, glitches with a financial report or anything like that. We're able to look before the grant period is over to really answer any of those issues that we may have. And then I want to talk about in-kind match next. Next slide, Nick.
Yeah, and David, I'll just throw in real quick too while we're making those clarifications. Like for COC, if you were on the previous training and we talked about the commitment letter, that is a COC regulatory requirement. For ESG, for one reason or another, a commitment letter is not technically a regulatory requirement, but again, just like David was describing the midterm grant report, it is a best practice, especially for the ESG recipient, to get a sense of what of their grantees are prepared to provide match, how much are they prepared to provide. But again, that distinction between technically a regulatory requirement versus best practice, kind of best way to meet the regulatory requirements. So I just wanted to make that quick clarification.
Thanks, Nick. So let's talk about what is in-kind match. So in-kind match is when the recipient or sub-recipient uses the value of any real property, equipment, goods, or services. So for instance, computers, cell phones, thinking about things that folks use, internet hotspots, whatever that may be, you want to make sure that you get evaluation of that equipment. At the time of donations, you want to make sure that you do that and follow best what is it, appreciation or depreciation calculations that your financial team probably does on yearly audits and all of those things. So I say that as to, not to create more work for folks, but to highlight that you probably already have some best practices that you all use in your organizations that can simply be applied to determine what the match amount would be for, again, any equipments, goods that you all are receiving. We had a question about food earlier. If it's donated, that would be an in-kind match, but you should determine the unit cost for those that food and get sort of invoices or some type of order report from who's donating the food to determine what those costs are. And the same thing for any real property. I think that's probably someone's donating or doing in-kind, letting you rent property for free or gave you a building. I'm pretty sure they can determine that based on market prices as well. In terms of services, um, you can determine what that amount can be by, hourly cost for staff, any type of travel cost that people may come in if someone is doing, health, coming in to do and screen folks for health, or provide therapy services. I'm just thinking out loud here on this slide and thinking through some examples here. But any questions about in-kind match at this juncture? Okay. Nope. All right. Next slide, please. Okay. So always with in-kind match, the documentation requirements vary slightly depending on whether the subrecipient utilizes an in-kind match of property, goods, and equipment or utilizes services. So let me just check my notes here a little bit. So we will go through this a little bit more, and I have the next slide has a kind of delineates this a little bit more. Next slide, Nick. So this graph here is attempting to just make it very easy for you all to get this information. As I stated, the ESG match guide that we created provides more detailed information for you all. So in terms of goods and equipment, prior to the grant period, as Nick stated, we're just requiring and host is requiring a commitment letter with the value of the donated goods to be provided, specific dates of the goods, the actual grant and fiscal year. Delineating some of those same requirements that we had when we talked about the cash, and the cash match as well. You want to include the value of commitments of land, buildings, and equipment. The value of these items is a one-time only and cannot be claimed by more than one project or by the same project in another year. Okay? So in terms of goods and equipment during the grant period, subrecipients must track and retain records for when goods and equipments were contributed to the project, the value of the goods and equipment, and a record of the activities provided by the goods and equipment. So, are you using the computers to do, the case management work, data entry? I would divide it by, staff type. If it's case managers, if it's outreach person, if it's intake, sort of this is what these computers and this is what this equipment is being used for. Halfway through and at the close of the grant period, submit a match report. And the same with in-kind, the cash match requirement, and documentation. You want to demonstrate that the total goods and equipments contributed to the project. And then you also want to include the valuation of the contributions and a record of which activities were supported by the goods and equipment. So at the close of the grant period, again, you want to do the final grant report and documentation. For services, again, there's sort of a different approach to documentation. The subrecipient must establish, must enter a formal MOU for services, and that's prior to the grant period. You want to ensure that you establish a system to document the actual value of services. at rates consistent with those ordinarily paid for similar work. If the recipient or subrecipient does not have employees performing this similar work, the rates must be consistent with those ordinarily paid by other employees for similar work in the same labor market. During the grant period, you want to, again, make sure that you have consistent tracking. Make sure that the records are available for inspection, especially the service hours provided. It's important to make sure that if people are documenting that they're working and going to see clients at certain periods of time, that is documented and verified, and that you have those records available for inspection if at all called on. And then you also want to ensure that, when halfway through and at the close of the grant period, you are submitting a match report. Again, I've said this ad nauseum because documentation is so important to this process, but you want to demonstrate the total match amount provided through services and document substantiated service hours that were provided by the service provider. Okay, so feel free to always and document this chart here. And again, the ESG match guide will have more information for you all. We ended kind of early, but I want to leave space if you all have any questions for us. That concludes sort of this ESG training. If you have any questions for us, Nick, Midori, if you all have any additional comments, if any other folks want to, bring anything up, we're happy to, take any of your questions or comments at this time. I think you all have listened to us for over an hour and a half at this point. So I think you all have listened all out and talked out. But any questions, anything burning up, specific questions to your programs, to your grant? Don't know if we can answer it, but we're happy to hear the question.
And that's for anyone. So I know, like, I have some of our contract administrators on too, like, if there's other questions. This is a wonderful time to ask.
And I'll just throw in too, in terms of context, like for ESG anyway, hopefully this is a good time for a match refresher, since ESG CV has been a time of match-free ESG living, which has been wonderful. But now with the annual grants going forward, match is back in place as a requirement. So hopefully this is a good refresher and a good opportunity to kind of get back on track on that way of thinking about ESG.
I will include our email in the chat if any questions do come up. Always, understand that after these sessions, sometimes it's just a lot of information and you need time to process and get back to us. So feel free to reach out to HUD, your HUD reps. Feel free to reach out to us here at home base. Also, reach out to Midori if you want. Don't all reach out at once, but definitely feel free to, let us know if you have any questions or if things come up throughout this process. We realize that this is, some things are new for you all there in the Denver area, but we're confident that these best practices and the forms and the guides that we've created with Midori's input will be very helpful to you all. So we will definitely love to hear how this process is working for you all, how these documents have helped, how we can improve anything with them. So definitely feel free to reach out and just let us know how things are going regarding, any of the match stuff that we talked about today.
Agreed. And I would say for Denver subrecipients, all, you know, you all have site visit opportunities to talk to folks about how things are going too. I'm gonna stop recording again, and then always, as